So I'm Kevin Warnes and I've been on Bradford Council for the last 12 years. I've been very interested in European issues since I was at university and went on to do postgraduate work looking at the way in which European governments coordinate their foreign policies. And since being active in the Green Party, I've run twice for the European Parliament in 2009 and 2014. So I feel very passionate about European issues. So we have this debate on the European Union, which has descended into mudslinging and extreme positioning on either side. On the one hand, we've got the Leave campaign, who say that if we stay in the EU, it'll be the end of 1,000 years of history, the sacrificing of all our sovereignty, which obviously is a gross exaggeration. And on the other hand, you've got the Remain camp, who say that if we leave the EU, it's going to be an economic disaster and it's going to lead to further conflict in Europe. Now, any sensible person understands that actually the answer is somewhere in between those two positions, that it's a balanced debate, and what the public is crying out for is reasonable, intelligent discussion of the issues. So at the moment, nearly half of people who are polled say they don't believe what either side is saying, and we are now at real risk of leaving the EU despite the fact that most people don't trust what the politicians are saying and don't know what the information is that they need to base their decision on. So here we are in the middle of this horrendous slanging match between the two sides, and it's therefore absolutely important that everyone discusses the issues properly and votes on June the 23rd, particularly if you want to stay in, because the worst thing that could happen would be a vote to leave based on 51% of people voting to leave on a 60% turnout, which would be a disaster for the country. This is not an abstract debate. The future of hundreds of thousands of people in Yorkshire depends on us making the right decision on June 23rd. If you think about it economically, we're tied into a single European market that thousands of Yorkshire companies benefit from, that delivers billions of pounds of inward investment into the Yorkshire economy and also enables Yorkshire businesses to invest in other European countries. At the same time, of course, you've got tens of thousands of people in Yorkshire who are working for businesses and who are therefore protected by European social and employment legislation. Now, we won't lose all of that if we come out of the EU. We'll probably keep most of it, but why take the risk? Why not simply carry on with the existing situation where we benefit already from some of the world's most progressive employee protections? And the third reason why I think we need to stay in is because of the environmental protections that the EU gives us. Over the last 30 or 40 years, the EU has passed something like 200 pieces of legislation which ensure air quality and water quality, which regulate the buying and selling of chemicals, and in fact have an impact on our everyday lives in ways that we often don't appreciate. So we benefit massively from being part of the single European market, from having social and employment protections through the EU, and from having EU legislation that protects our environment. And finally, you've got the fact that we can travel freely across 28 countries. And I have 2 children and I want them to enjoy that freedom as well. We can work in Europe, we can study in Europe, we can retire if we want to in Europe. I have people, friends of mine, who are talking about retiring in countries like France or Hungary. And of course the same freedoms apply to our European neighbours as well. And I think that's a wonderful situation. The real risk here is that we withdraw from the European Union and we jeopardise this, this vibrant cultural relationship with our closest neighbours. So a really good example of the way in which the EU debate gets distorted is this whole question of sovereignty. You've got the Leave campaigners saying that we've sacrificed all our sovereignty to Brussels. We've got the Remain campaign saying, oh, the EU doesn't make any difference to how we operate as a sovereign state. And again, the truth's somewhere in between. The fact is that on all the really big questions that have dominated British politics over the last 6 years, say, we've retained control. We remain a sovereign country. And those areas where we share sovereignty with our EU partners are areas where it makes sense to make decisions together in the interests and to the benefit of all the member states. So if you look back over the last 6 years, let's take education. The academisation programme that was rolled out was nothing to do with Brussels, everything to do with the Department of Education in London. The trebling of university tuition fees in 2010, nothing to do with Europe, everything to do with decisions made here in London by British politicians. Take health reform, the massive, radical, top-down reorganisation privatisation of the NHS that's taken place since 2012 is nothing to do with the European Union. It was a decision taken by a Conservative government based on UK domestic political priorities. And that's the way it should be. I happen to think it's the wrong decision, but the fact is that we retain control over our healthcare system. The welfare reforms that have been brought in, the bedroom tax, the cap on benefits, the abortive attempt to take away working tax credits from some of our poorest working people, those were all decisions made here in the UK by British politicians acting in a sovereign manner. Look at defence, the fact that we're already investing billions of pounds in replacing the Trident nuclear weapons system, for all the wrong reasons in my view, but nonetheless that's a decision being made here in London by the Brits and nothing to do with our European partners. Or transport, we're going to waste tens of billions of pounds building HS2 when we could be investing that money in our local bus networks and wider rail network for everyone's benefit. And that's all about UK politics, nothing about the EU. So in all these areas, actually, when you look at it, it's nonsense for UKIP and the Tory right to claim that we've sacrificed all our sovereignty. In the areas of decision making that affect people's everyday lives, for most people, most of the time, we retain control. Where we share sovereignty, it's very much to our benefit. So, for example, it makes sense for us to sit round the tables in Brussels and make joint decisions on managing the single European market, because we buy and sell billions of euros worth of goods across borders every year, so why not have joint shared sovereignty arrangements over that? On employment protections, again, we've got workers moving around Europe, we've got companies employing people in different countries, so there's no reason why we can't share sovereignty when it comes to working hours, when it comes to giving temporary workers the same rights as permanent staff, when it comes to giving people more access to parental leave, for example. That all makes sense. I don't really see what the problem is. And then you've got the environment, where since the Maastricht Treaty, decisions have been made by majority vote in Brussels, with the European Parliament having a say as well. Now, air molecules don't carry passports, water flows from one country to the other, we all fish and bathe in the same North Sea or Atlantic Ocean or coastal waters. So therefore, why not have mechanisms in place for us to make these decisions together when it comes to managing our carbon pollution? British coal-fired power stations produce carbon that affects the climate in France and Germany and Italy and vice versa. So to me, it doesn't make any sense for us to pull up the drawbridge and walk away from these arenas where we can make joint decisions for the benefit of all of us. The really crazy thing about these debates about sovereignty is that UKIP and the Leave campaign say that we are being bulldozed by faceless Brussels bureaucrats, and nothing can be further from the truth. The reality is that when you look at EU decisions made in the Council of Ministers, the UK supports more than 90% of those decisions, because our ministers who are sat around the table can see that the decisions, the proposed legislation, is in our best interests. In any case, the European Commission bends over backwards to take into account the views and the feelings of Member States' governments and also the European Parliament, because at the end of the day, the Commission proposes legislation, but it's the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament that have the law-making powers. And so, in fact, what seems from a Brexit point of view as a complex, distant institution that is trampling over British sovereign interests, when you look at how decisions are made in Brussels, they are much more often in our interests than somehow against what we want. And anyone who understands how the EU works and talks honestly and openly about it will tell you the same thing. Life isn't simple. So why should government be simple, and why should people expect the EU to be simple? What we're faced with are complex international challenges, and therefore we need sophisticated ways of dealing with those. And simply, pulling up the drawbridge on Europe isn't the solution to those challenges. The other thing is that even if we leave the EU, the chances are that we'll remain subject to EU law anyway, because we're going to want to continue to trade with this huge single European market, and so like the Norwegians and like the Swiss, we will end up signing a deal that involves us accepting most of the legislation that we currently have to abide by. The difference would be, of course, that we wouldn't have a say over that legislation in the first place. So in effect, we'll be shooting ourselves in the foot if we leave Brussels. One reason why I like the EU, and I feel very passionate about it as a European citizen, is because I feel that although the institutions, the Council of Ministers, the Parliament, the Commission, can certainly be improved, actually, when you look at it, they work pretty well. So in other words, there's this myth that the EU is somehow not democratic. When you look at how decisions are made, it's much more democratic than most people realise. So we have a share of decisions in the Council of Ministers, we have a share of decisions in the European Parliament, where we're represented by 73 British MEPs. The Commission itself, while it proposes legislation, it doesn't have the kind of law-making powers that Michael Gove and Boris Johnson claim. Another huge issue that dominates the debate and is distorting people's view of the EU is migration. And there's no doubt about it, migration has gone up significantly in the last few years. The last 2 years we've had about 330,000 people net coming into the UK. So it is a huge issue, and that kind of population growth in the long term, i.e. over the next several decades and beyond, is unsustainable. It's part of a global population crisis that affects not just the UK, but also the EU as a whole and other parts of the world. And in effect, what we need to do, I think, is just take a big step back here, and rather than thinking about it in terms of Britain versus Europe, think about it in terms of a shared challenge that all the European societies have to face in terms of how they manage the numbers of people who are living in their societies and who are also travelling from one society to another. So the bottom line for me is that we have to think intelligently about population as a challenge that we all have to deal with. So if you talk to the average person, what are their real concerns about migration? What it boils down to is they want decent access for themselves and their children to healthcare, to education, to the transport system, to housing, to jobs, to decent pay. Now you can break all that down. You can say, for example, fine, okay, we need more homes, let's build more homes. Let's change the kinds of homes that we're building. Let's opt for more high-density housing, for example. You can talk about schools, and in fact, the crisis in British education over the last 6 years isn't being caused by migration, it's being caused by underfunding of our school system. So if we need to put more resources into those areas, let's do that. The same with healthcare. Everyone knows that health tourism is minuscule in comparison to the other challenges that are faced by the British healthcare system. If the system's under strain, it's not because of people coming to this country, it's because of the way in which NHS budgets are being squeezed by British politicians for other reasons. Looking at transport, people talk about road congestion. Nigel Farage was blaming immigrants for road congestion at one point last year. If we want to get cars off our roads, then we need to create high quality, comprehensive public transport systems. We need to invest in our buses, invest in our trains, and give people a real choice about how they get from A to B. People often worry about immigrants taking their jobs, and yet we know statistically that immigrants who come to the UK create work as well as take jobs. So 1 in 7 new British companies has been set up by somebody who was born abroad. One of people's biggest worries is that migrants coming into the UK will undercut our wages, and we know that is a problem with the least well-paid people in the UK. Now the answer isn't to shut our borders to EU migration. The answer actually is to introduce a decent national living wage and to make sure that all employers have to pay that wage. That seems to me to make a lot more sense and would benefit everybody. And if people are worried about competing for jobs that require certain skills, then surely we can improve the way we deliver skills training through our schools and through a national apprenticeship programme, rather than, again, trying to put the cap on migrants from abroad. So we have population growth in the UK. Is it all down to the EU? No, it's not. If you look at the population growth in my lifetime, I'm 50 years old, over the last 45, 50 years, the population of the UK has increased by 10 million. Now of that, 5 million is due to homegrown population growth. So for example, we live in an ageing population. When my children have their kids in maybe 10, 15 years' time, the chances are that 1 in 3 of those children will live to the age of 100. So as a society, we have to find ways of managing our ageing and increasing population, and leaving the EU won't help us to solve those challenges. What about asylum seekers? We have something like 40,000 people coming to the UK over the last year who are here claiming asylum or here as refugees. Now, that has nothing to do with the EU, it's to do with our obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention. So whether we stay or leave, we will still have those people coming in. If you look at students, hundreds of thousands of people come to study in this country every year, and that's a wonderful thing. And our universities are crying out for more good students from abroad. Now, most of them are coming from outside the EU. A third of them are coming from China. The government has identified China as one of our major trading partners for future decades. So there's no way in the world that British ministers are going to want to cut off that flow of Chinese students to the country. And the EU debate won't have any impact on that at all. The other big driver of population growth is the numbers of Brits who emigrate abroad. Now, over the last 6 years, the number has come down by 100,000 a year, so that has boosted, if you like, net migration into the UK. In any case, even if you ignore all those factors that I've just mentioned that are drivers of population growth, the reality is that if we vote to leave the EU, we're going to negotiate a trade deal with Brussels that will almost certainly leave us having to accept the free movement of workers into the UK. It's a fundamental principle of the European Union. So the Norwegians and the Swiss have had to accept that, and I can't imagine for a moment that Brussels and our major European partners will allow the UK to opt out of that rule. The really disheartening thing about the debate about migration is that it sweeps to one side the huge benefits that we all share that comes from this exchange of people across borders. Our employers want people to come into this country with the skills they need to succeed. Our universities want students coming in from abroad to share their knowledge and their cultural experiences. And of course it's a two-way street. 2 million Brits live in Europe and enjoy the benefits of travelling and working and retiring in other European societies. I enjoy that freedom. I've lived abroad for a year in one EU member state, and I want my kids to have the same freedom. And my worry is that if we leave the EU and the drawbridge comes up, that we're going to regret the loss of those freedoms. So the Leave campaign are arguing that we're handing over £350 million a week to Brussels. And everybody now accepts, even the Leave campaigners, this is not true, because we get so much money back in the form of our rebate, in the form of money for our farmers, in the form of regional development funds, in the form of research funding for our universities. And all of that actually brings that money down to something like £110 million a week, according to the Treasury Select Committee. So that works out at just under £10 billion a year, which I must admit is still a lot of money. But then what you have to do, of course, is pull back and look at what the British government spends overall. So in the year ahead, the Brits are going to spend about £770 billion on healthcare, education, defence, welfare and so on. So in effect, our total net contribution to the European Union works out at 1/80th of UK government spending. So it's something that we can easily afford as one of the world's richest countries. And that doesn't even take into account the fact that British government spending is less than half of our total national wealth. So in fact, actually, the net cost of the EU for the UK is pretty small compared to some of the other things that we spend money on. So for example, we spend 7 times as much money on education, we spend 14 times as much money on our pension system, we spend much more on defence and all the other big ticket items that we're happy as taxpayers to fund because we regard those things as being in our interest. And from my perspective, I think the EU is fundamentally in our interest as well. So therefore it's only right that we make a contribution. In any case, if we leave the EU, we will sign that trade deal that I've talked about before, and as a consequence of that, like Norway, we will almost certainly be asked to make a financial contribution to the EU. The Norwegians chip in more money per head than the UK does at the moment. So it's ridiculous to assume that we'll get any of that 10 billion back, let alone half of it. And the final thing, of course, is that the Leave campaign are talking about investing all of that money that we'll get back in the NHS, which is hard to imagine if you look back over the last 6 years, the way in which the Conservative Lib Dem coalition and now the Conservative government have squeezed healthcare funding in the UK. I just don't regard it as a credible promise from people like Michael Gove and Boris Johnson that all that EU money is suddenly going to find its way into our hospitals. And then of course you have to ask the question, where's the money going that we're paying over to Brussels? Well, a lot of it is going to regional development programmes in places like Central and Eastern Europe, where road networks are being modernised, rail networks are being modernised, communications networks are being upgraded, sewage systems are being improved, and all of that is opening up new markets for British companies here in Yorkshire that are exporting to countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and so on. Now, the value of our exports, UK exports as a whole, to Central and Eastern Europe over the last 10 years has doubled. It's now worth £16 billion a year. And by pulling out of the EU, we're putting all of that at risk. So it's a complex picture. There's no easy solutions. The world is a fast-changing place. There are no cost-free solutions to this. Yes, you know, if we stay in the EU, we'll continue to get benefits from staying in, but we'll have to make compromises on our sovereignty, for example. We'll have to continue to make a net budget contribution. But then if we pull out of the EU, the costs are going to be far greater. So we have to be intelligent about this and accept the fact that in a complex, fast-changing world, we need a place where governments can come together and make decisions together that are in the interests of all their peoples and which meet the challenges of the 21st century, whether it's managing our trade, managing the employment rights of tens of millions of Europeans, and most importantly, from my perspective, managing the huge environmental challenges that we all face together, like climate change and making the transition to the kind of low-carbon economy that we all need.